Check, 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 check. Check, 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 check. Mic check. Mic check, 1, 2. Mic check. Mic check. Mic check, 1, 2. Hi, folks. Ryan Denton here. So a lot of times we get asked, how as street preachers do we stay zealous? How do we stay focused? How do we keep the fire going within us so that we can go out and preach on a daily basis, considering the difficulties that come with this kind of ministry? And to me, the most obvious answer is, of course, the Bible. To be a student of the Bible, to live in the Bible, to constantly be refreshing our soul in the Bible, not just reading it, not just checking off a box, but actually really looking into the Scriptures, studying the Scriptures. Also, prayer. That's a huge aspect of even Bible reading. So prayer, Bible study, but another way is just good literature, good books. I don't think there's anything, for me anyways, that keeps the spirit going like good books. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to mention a few of just good quality street preaching books. You know, now's the time of year; it's getting cold outside. Street preachers are not going to be able to go out and be as active as they want to be, perhaps. So now is a great time to read and to really refresh and reflect on the things of God. And also, of course, with Christmas coming around, if you know street preachers, if you have that special person in your life who is an open-air preacher, now's a great time to look into some of this literature and perhaps find a good book. All of these books I'm going to recommend today are for the most part, as far as I know, they're relatively inexpensive. Of course, nowadays you can find something that's used. So anyways, I'm just going to run through this list, try to keep it short. We have about 12 books here. The first one, of course, is Charles Spurgeon's Lectures to My Students. I don't know if this is going to come up on the video flipped or inverted. So if so, you know, I'm going to, if you look at the description, you'll see all the books that are listed that we speak about today. They're listed in the description. So go ahead and go there if you're trying to figure out what we're saying. So Lectures to My Students. The great thing about this book from Charles Spurgeon is that it has 2 chapters devoted specifically to open-air preaching. And it's some of the best material out there on the subject. And of course, Charles Spurgeon was not a street preacher in the contemporary use of that term. He was a pastor, but he also street preached, and he was certainly very respectful and encouraged street preaching to take place. And so he definitely has a lot of good information there. So that's Charles Spurgeon, Lectures to My Students. Now this next one is an autobiography of Peter Cartwright, and it's called The Backwoods Preacher. Now, what's interesting about this is a first-person autobiography written in the 1800s, and Peter Cartwright, when you read through here, I don't agree with Peter Cartwright's theology. He was a circuit writer, a Methodist circuit writer. What's really interesting about this book is the guy is just, you know, call it what you want to call it. He's on fire for the Lord, and he's a soul winner. And so he devotes his life, you know, when you read through here, it just oozes this guy who just every waking moment of his life is directed towards the Lord and towards the lost. And some of the adventures and the scenes that take place in this book is really incredible. At one point, he actually encounters Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. So he actually has an encounter with Joseph Smith in one section. And really it's just about how the gospel is advancing westward. And he literally is in the backwoods. He's wading through rivers. He's, you know, shacked up in certain situations. Indians are shooting arrows all around him at one point. So it's definitely a riveting book, and it's one of the most just soul-warming books as far as keeping the fire go. If you read this book and you don't want to go out and win souls and preach Christ, then you know, something's definitely wrong. The next one, I read this book years ago. It's a I don't even know what the title is. It's an autobiography by a guy named James MacKendrick, and let me see if I can find the title. So it says formerly the title was Seen and Heard. I don't know. There's no title. I tell you, this is a gem though. It's a guy in the northern parts of the UK, and he in Scotland, and there's revivals breaking out, and he's going to these little fishing communities again in the late 1800s, and everywhere he goes, the Spirit of God is just coming down. And so that's a really encouraging book. Again, so this book's actually not explicitly about open air preaching, but you do see kind of like the Cartwright book. You do see a lot of scenes in the open air, and so that's a good book. Now this one, here's another one from a Scottish guy. This is a sketch of the life of Robert Annan. Now this is a third person account. It's okay. It's not a bad book. It's a really short book, and it's about a guy that, even on the back cover it talks about how his life is similar to John Newton, who of course wrote Amazing Grace, and in a lot of ways it is. He has this really rebellious, reckless past. The Lord saves him, and he spends the rest of his life in evangelistic activity, and so that's kind of what this book is about. Now this next one is a somewhat of a needle in a haystack kind of book. I don't know if it's hard to find. I didn't have too much trouble finding this book. I don't even think I was looking for it. I stumbled upon it. It's called Life Experience and Journal of an Open Air Preacher and City Missionary up to January 1864. So it's quite a title by a guy named Nathaniel Pidgeon. It's a autobiographical account, so it's first person. And this guy was actually a street preacher in Australia. And originally, I think he was originally from England. Somehow he gets to at one point he's in South Africa and then on to Australia, and he's out there and he's preaching in the streets. And it's a really good book. And one of the perks about reading, especially the first person accounts, is that you kind of pick up on what they do and how they're seeing this ministry that God's given them and the way they take it on. And then we can of course apply that to some of what we're doing. And if nothing else, you see the exact same responses to their preaching in the 1800s that we're seeing in our day. So just another reason to be encouraged. Now this, of course, is, you've probably heard of this. If you're familiar, if you've read open-air preaching literature, if you've looked it up, it's 7 Years Street Preaching in San Francisco, California by William Taylor. And this kind of like the Peter Cartwright Backwoods Preacher book is really fascinating because not only is it in an account of street preaching, but it's a scene into American history. This is taking place San Francisco at the time of the Gold Rush. So this was a street preacher during the time of the Gold Rush. Theologically, he's another guy. He's also a Methodist, and so I would disagree with him in a lot of ways. But it's a good book. It's an encouraging book. One of the things that's unique about this book is that you get a lot of his sermons that he's actually preaching in the open air. So you'll have some scenes about what's taking place in his life and what happens when he goes out and he preaches. But you also have verbatim accounts of what he's preaching. So sermons. And then in the beginning, he has a few tidbits on street preaching that's really encouraging and still rings true today. So that's a good book. Now here's another one. It's somewhat popular among street preaching and street preachers. It's let me see if I can get that up there. So this is The Street Preacher. It's an autobiography of Robert Flockhart. Now Robert Flockhart was saved under William Carey's ministry in India. He was a soldier. He was out there in India. He got saved. He returns to his native land, Scotland, and the city where he lived was Edinburgh. And he spends over 40 years preaching on the streets. And so this is a really, really good book. It's the autobiography of Robert Flockhart. And the next two are probably my favorites as far as just books that just inflame you. Actually, let me start with this one. So this is another more or less popular book. It's the autobiography of George Whitefield. And this one is the one that Arnold Dallimore put out, and it's 2 volumes. So this is the first volume here, and there's 2 volumes. But it's exactly what it says. It's the life and times of the great evangelist of the 18th century revival, George Whitefield. And it's just, again, one of those books where if you read through there and you're not inflamed with this zeal and desire to go preach the gospel and to see souls saved and to live for the glory of God and to commit yourself to a holy life, something's off. So this is a really good book. Now, my personal favorite, and it's also Martyn LloydJones' personal favorite, and if you read it, it'll probably become your personal favorite. This, too, is a 2-volume set. This is called The Calvinistic Methodist Fathers of Wales. So this is volume 1. There's 2 volumes in it. And what this is an account of the revivals that were taking place in Wales at the same time as the revivals were taking place in England and in America during the time of George Whitefield. And in fact, the guys in Wales were very good friends with George Whitefield. At times, Whitefield would even go to Wales and preach there. And so this book is just filled with scenes that will just absolutely encourage your soul. It'll fill you with a fire in your bones. I cannot recommend this book enough. It's The Calvinistic Methodist Fathers of Wales. Martyn LloydJones' favorite book. I promise you, when you read it, you'll understand why. It's basically the account of how the gospel flourished in Wales in the 1700s. And then... So I have 2 that I don't have. I have them lent out. There's 2 books that I want to mention. I don't have them. And the first one, I did write them down. So the first one is William Evans, and his book is called simply Open Air Preaching. And he wrote it in 1901. It's a great account. And I like this because it's not a biography. It's not an account of his life. It's just practical advice on how to go about open air preaching. Now that's 1901, but it's still relevant in a lot of ways today. And then the other one is Edwin Byington, and his book is called Open Air Preaching, a Practical Manual for Pastors, Evangelists, and Other Christian Workers. And that actually came out in 1892. And again, in the description, you'll see these books on here because I don't have them. But you'll definitely want to pick these last 2 books up because they're not so much autobiographical as they are just really good handbooks on how to go about the work of open air preaching. They were some of the first ones that I read, and you just start feeling that fire, and you want to know more as far as how to go out, how to go about doing it. And then those are great books to look into. And then just to make a plug for the book that Scott Smith and I wrote, it's called A Certain Sound, a primer on open air preaching. And one of the reasons we wrote this is simply because most of the literature on open air preaching, explicitly open air preaching, again, like we just saw, they all date back to the early 1900s at best. And theologically, we wanted something that was consistent with what we believe the Bible teaches. And so that's A Certain Sound, a primer on open air preaching. It's somewhat of an updated attempt at what the Byington and William Evans were trying to do as far as just having a good practical handbook or tool book for how to go about the ministry in the open air. And so, again, all of these books are in the description. I would highly encourage you, if you are a street preacher, now's the time to be in the books. I think as street preachers, one of the things that you see is that street preachers tend to be less academic, less scholarly. I'm not saying that's a bad thing necessarily, but I think that can be a weakness because we're more action oriented, we're action based. We want to go. Whereas a lot of times, and I'm not saying this is all the time, but sometimes on the opposite hand, you'll have like some of the more academic, scholarly types of ministers who don't really go. So I think we both have our advantages, and there are disadvantages to the strengths that we have. So if we are action oriented, one of the weaknesses we might have is just sitting down and reading book or reading books, and trying to be better students of the Word, try to be better students of theology. Whereas some people who are really good students of theology probably need a little more push as far as getting out and going. So, again, as always, if you have any questions or comments, get a hold of us. You can go to ChristInTheWild.com. Subscribe if you want to follow some of our material and the video that we're putting out. Again, check out the description. So let's just as we always try to do here and try to encourage our audience to do, is just keep looking to Christ, keep preaching Christ, and most importantly, especially in light of what we're talking about today, get to know Christ. We need to get to know Christ more and more, and we get to do that through His Word, through prayer, and then in certain areas like books. And when it comes to books, one last thing. A lot of times people say, well, we don't need to have anything written by man. We don't need to read things written by man. We have the Bible, we have prayer. And although I understand what people mean when they say that, I think we also need to recognize and to appreciate the fact that Christ does give teachers and pastors, and in this case evangelists, to the church in order to equip the church and to equip the saints for the work of ministry. And part of the way He does that is through books. When the people He's given the gift of teaching, pastoring, evangelizing, when they write literature, that's another way for us to be equipped to do the work of ministry. And so I think we need to take advantage of good books. Like Spurgeon said, read many good books, but live in the Bible. So that needs to be our motto. But that's not to say that all books are irrelevant. And so let's just keep looking to Christ, and God bless.